I can still feel the weight of the sand pressing against my chest, the air escaping from my lungs, and the muffled sound of the guards saying that I deserved to die. There, buried alive in the desert of Riyadh, I thought that would be my end. And maybe you would never imagine how it all began. It did not start with a pastor, nor with a missionary. The first spark of the gospel entered my life through a random video I secretly watched on my phone. A video of Charlie Kirk talking about freedom, truth, and a Jesus I had never known. From that moment until the day I was sentenced for choosing the Bible instead of the Quran, every step of my life became a spiritual war. I fled the war in Gaza, only to be buried alive in Saudi Arabia. But before the final shovel of sand fell, something impossible happened. That is what you are going to see today. Before I tell you how all of this happened, just check if you are already subscribed, if you left your like, and comment your city or country. I want to know how far this story has reached. I still feel the weight of the sun from that day burning my face, the dry air tearing through my throat, and the harsh sound of sand being dragged by the wind as they led me to that hole. With each step, my legs trembled, as if my whole body were trying to resist. Knowing there was no return, I was tied up, my hands bound behind my back, and yet I managed to hold the old Bible that had been confiscated and later returned only to become part of my sentence. Colonel al-Rashid walked a few feet ahead, his rigid posture like an iron shadow in the middle of the desert. He stopped, turned to me, and repeated with a coldness that still echoes in my mind, "Choose the Quran and live. Choose that Bible, and you will be buried with it." I felt the sentence pierce my chest like a knife, but not because I feared death. What truly crushed me was the thought of how something as simple as searching for truth could lead someone to that point. I remember looking at the Bible in my fingers, the worn cover, the bent edges, some pages stained with sweat and dust from the nights when I hid it under my bedding. That Bible was not just an object. It was like a breath of light that had entered my life silently through videos I watched in secret on my phone. Videos I should never have opened, but that changed everything. And while the guards waited for my decision with a tension so thick it could be cut, I felt inside me the cruel mixture of fear and conviction. It was as if my soul were divided between an entire world, screaming for me to give up, and a soft, almost imperceptible voice whispering, "Do not be afraid." And before any word could leave my mouth, I knew that if I wanted to tell you what truly happened, I would have to go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the persecution, but the beginning of my life, where everything seemed simpler, more bearable, and at the same time more fragile than I could have imagined. My name is Layla Mansour, and this is the story of how Jesus entered my life when I least expected it. Not through a church, nor a missionary, nor a forbidden book. It all began with videos I watched in secret on the internet, trying to find some meaning in the midst of chaos. But before reaching that point, you need to understand where I came from. Because Gaza is not just a place on the map. Gaza is an open wound, a dust that settles into your bones, a resistance born out of despair, and a faith carried like the last remaining nourishment. I grew up in the old neighborhood of Al-Shaja'iyah, one of the places most marked by time, by war, and by forced silences. The houses were so close to one another that I could hear when the neighbor lit the stove, when children running in the alley fell and began to cry, when someone argued about money or politics. Water arrived at unpredictable hours, and I learned early to run with buckets before the pressure dropped. Electricity was like a rare visitor, some hours a day when we were lucky. And still, there was life there. There was laughter. There were women talking at the doors, men playing dominoes at dusk, and a faith so strong it seemed capable of holding up broken walls. My father died when I was a child. An accident, they said. My mother never cried in front of me, but I know she shattered inside. She always said with a firm and tired voice, "Layla, Allah tests the strongest," and I believe that. Not because I understood everything, but because in that place, believing was the only way to keep breathing. My mother taught me to recite the Quran when I was only 8 years old. I was proud of that. To me, it was a seal of identity, the one thing no one could ever take from me. I grew up with small dreams. I wanted to help children. I wanted to work. I wanted to see my family survive. And even on nights when distant bombs lit up the sky, I still believed that someday everything would be all right. But everything changed in October of 2023. That day still visits me in my dreams. I was sweeping the yard when the first explosion cut through the air, as if the sky itself had opened. The ground trembled beneath my feet. My mother fell to her knees in fear, and I ran inside on instinct. When the waves of smoke began spreading through the neighborhood, people screamed names, calling for their children, their brothers, for whoever was not inside the house. I ran to the window and saw buildings dissolving into clouds of dust. The smell of gunpowder and destruction entered the house as if it had a life of its own. The bombs came without warning, and each new blast felt closer than the last. The war that year was not like the others. It was not just isolated attacks or tense nights. It was a continuous, relentless assault, as if the entire world were collapsing around us. Entire buildings disappeared. Neighbors I saw every day vanished, never to return. Children disappeared beneath rubble, and only after hours of digging would someone find a hand, a shoe, a school notebook. I saw that. I heard that. I breathed that. And it was impossible not to carry the smell of death even in my hair. My mother was injured when one of the attacks hit the street next to ours. She was bleeding from her forehead, and her despair wasn't from the physical pain, but from the fear of losing me. Layla, we need to get out. We need to get out now, before we're buried alive. I had never seen my mother tremble like that. It affected me in a way I can't explain. It was there, on that dark and suffocating night, that I realized that if we stayed in Gaza, there would be no future. The cruelest twist came when my aunt's house was hit. I loved that place. I loved my cousins. I loved the sense of normalcy we sometimes found there. But when we arrived, there was only a pile of concrete. We believed everyone was dead, till, after almost an hour, we heard a faint cry coming from under the broken slabs. The makeshift rescuers pulled out the two boys, alive but unconscious. That destroyed what little hope I had left. I told my mother, if we don't get out now, we won't survive. That's how our escape began. The walk to the Rafah checkpoint felt like a journey through hell. There were thousands of people crammed together, wounded being carried on makeshift blankets, desperate mothers with babies who no longer cried, men clutching empty water bottles as if they were treasures. The air was too hot, too dry, too thick. Fear had a smell. Children cried for water that no one had. And, to make matters worse, the explosions still echoed in the distance, reminding us that we were fleeing, but we were not safe. When we finally reached the gate, my heart nearly leaped out of my chest. There was a list of names authorized to cross. The Egyptian officer called out the names one by one. Mine wasn't there. My mother's wasn't either. And in that instant, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. It was as if the door of hope had been slammed shut before us. My mother began to cry silently, devastated. But then, suddenly, a voice called my name. I looked and saw a man I recognized only by sight, a distant relative, someone who used to stop by family gatherings many years before. He approached quickly, looked me in the eyes, and whispered, "Come with me." Quickly. I didn't think twice. I just grabbed my mother's hand, and we followed. He spoke to the Egyptian soldiers, made gestures, mentioned humanitarian organizations. In a few minutes, as if by a miracle, we managed to cross. And that's how I left Gaza behind. Not out of courage, not out of strength, but out of the terrible feeling that if we didn't leave, we would just be two more names on an endless list of losses. That day, as I walked with my feet sinking into the hot desert dust and the border disappearing behind me, I had no idea that the greatest battle of my life was yet to come. I didn't know that, months later, I would be in that other desert, with a parched throat, my hands bound, and a Bible against my chest, waiting for a fate that no human being should have to face. And it is precisely here that my story continues, because that crossing, which should have represented freedom, was only the beginning of something much deeper, much more intense, and much more dangerous than anything I had ever experienced. When we crossed the border into Egypt, I thought there would finally be some air to breathe. But I hadn't understood that, for people like us, survival isn't a destination. It's just a temporary pause before the next storm. We didn't stay in Egypt long enough to understand the new routine. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of refugees trying to settle in, but the government needed to manage the flow, relocate, empty centers that became overcrowded in a matter of days. When they announced that groups from Gaza would be sent to other Arab countries because there was no more capacity, I felt a chill in my stomach. It wasn't a choice. It was an order. And when they called my name and my mother's to board for Riyadh, I felt like I was entering a dark room without knowing what awaited me. The plane was silent, full of tired faces, some crying softly, others just staring into space. My mother held my hand so tightly that sometimes it cut off the circulation in my fingers. She said, "Layla, keep your head down. Don't ask questions. Don't draw attention." And I promised myself I would do exactly that. At that moment, I still believed I would be able to hide from the world, to adapt, to be invisible. But I quickly discovered that, in Riyadh, even silence can scream. When we landed, we were led to a secluded area of the airport, a white, cold, and overly bright room. Men with clipboards spoke quickly, writing down names, taking photos, asking for documents. Everything was fast, impersonal, rigid. Riyadh seemed like another planet. The women wore black abayas that moved like shadows around the room. The guards maintained closed expressions, and there were posters everywhere talking about obedience, religious laws, moral conduct. It seemed that every corner of that place whispered, "Be careful. We're watching everything." We were sent to a refugee center on the outskirts of the city. It was small, cramped, and profoundly silent. The silence was almost physical. There were no children running around, no laughter, no lively conversations like there had been in Gaza despite the war. There, people seemed afraid even to exist. I could feel it in the air. The women avoided raising their voices, avoided asking too many questions, avoided looking directly at the guards. Everything seemed like an emotional minefield, where any wrong step could trigger something invisible and dangerous. I tried to act the same way, but inside I was falling apart. In the first few days, I didn't even sleep. At night, we stayed in a room we shared with two women who had also lost almost everything. My mother would start snoring when she finally fell asleep, but I would stay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling my chest tighten as if an invisible hand were pressing on my heart. With every sound in the hallway, my body froze. With every door slamming, I was sure something bad was about to happen. I knew I couldn't show weakness, but my mind no longer obeyed reason. I started having panic attacks, silent, hidden, suffocating. I would get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom, lock the door, sit on the cold floor, and try to breathe deeply. But it felt like something in my chest was breaking. My mother didn't know. I couldn't let her know. She was still trying to be strong, and I didn't want to be another burden on her shoulders. I kept smiling, saying I'm fine. But inside, I felt like I was losing myself. It was one of those early mornings that my hands began to tremble so much that I dropped a bottle of water in the bathroom. The noise echoed down the hallway, and I froze, expecting someone to come and ask why I was awake at that hour. But no one came. And at that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to hide it, my soul was begging for help. Days later, the unexpected happened. A young man who had also fled Gaza, a young man named Khaled, discreetly called me over in the courtyard. He handed me an old cell phone with a cracked screen and simply said, "Use it carefully, only at night, and never let anyone see it." I knew this could be costly if discovered, but I needed an escape. I needed to feel that the world hadn't ended. And then, that same night, when everyone was asleep, I sat on the floor, hidden behind the bed, covered the light with the sheet, and started searching for random videos. Nothing specific, just trying to distract myself from the anxiety that was eating me up. Till one of the recommended videos appeared with a title I would never forget: "Why Jesus is the Only One Who Can Save You." Charlie Kirk. I didn't know who this man was. I had never heard his name. But the word "save" caught my attention like a cry in the middle of a desert. I clicked, and there, in that stuffy room in Riyadh, listening at almost the lowest volume, I heard a man speak with a courage I didn't understand. He spoke about freedom, about truth, about faith in Jesus, in a direct, firm, almost provocative way. He spoke like someone who wasn't afraid of losing anything, and that surprised me. Because there, where I was, even breathing differently seemed dangerous. I watched the entire video, then another, and something strange began to happen inside me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't resentment, it was curiosity. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a forbidden question. What if everything I believed wasn't the whole story? I closed my phone in fear, as if the walls could see my thoughts. But the seed had already been planted, and once that seed enters the heart, it never leaves. A few days later, I was helping unload boxes of medical supplies when a volunteer arrived. Clara Hernandez. I remember her smile. Not an exaggerated smile, but a gentle, almost shy smile, as if she had learned to speak kindly in places where the pain was too great. She was from Spain and came to the center regularly to offer basic care, blood pressure checks, dressings, vitamins. But that morning, something different caught my attention. As she bent down to pick up a box, the necklace she was wearing slipped out of her blouse, a small silver crucifix. I glanced quickly, reflexively, and then looked away, afraid someone would notice I'd seen it. In Riyadh, even a symbol could cause problems, but Clara didn't hide it. She didn't even try. She continued working as if that object were simply part of who she was, not a raised flag, but a quiet conviction. While we were in the warehouse reorganizing the boxes, something fell out of her bag. A black, soft-cover book covered in colorful post-it notes along the edges. I recognized it immediately. A Bible. My heart raced and my skin went cold. I quickly bent down and picked up the book with trembling hands. I handed it to her almost without looking and whispered, "You should be careful. This could put you in danger." She closed the book delicately, holding it as if it were fragile, and said to me with a calmness that disarmed me, "I only bring them when I feel that someone needs hope." It hit me like an arrow. It was as if she had spoken directly to my soul, but I looked away, took a step back, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. But it was too late. Between the Charlie Kirk videos and that moment with Clara, something inside me began to open, a small but deep crack. That night, when everyone was asleep, I sat with my phone buried under the covers and searched for more videos about Jesus. I wanted to understand why those words affected me so much. I wanted to understand the security I saw in Charlie's voice, the serenity on Clara's face, the courage in that symbol she didn't hide. I opened a video that talked about John chapter 14, and the first words I heard were, "Let not your heart be troubled." I couldn't take it anymore. I cried, a silent, deep cry, the kind of cry that doesn't come from the eyes, but from a painful place that we try to hide for years. I cried for everything, for the war, for the fear, for the guilt, for the feeling of being broken. I cried because those words seemed to have been written for me, as if someone knew exactly what I was carrying and put it there, without pressure, without demands, simply offering rest. After that, I started reading. Not once, not twice, but every night. I read John 14 repeatedly, as if that could hold my heart in place. I waited for the moment when all the lights went out in the hallway, and the women in the room began to breathe more slowly. Then I would get up, go to the bathroom, and lock myself in. I would sit on the cold floor and spend hours reading the Bible hidden on my phone and watching Charlie Kirk talk about spiritual courage. And that's how the twist I could never have imagined happened. The dreams began. In the first one, I was in a dark field, completely alone. The wind was blowing strongly, but it wasn't an ordinary wind. It seemed to carry a heavy silence, and in the middle of this emptiness, the figure of a man dressed in white appeared. I couldn't see his face. I never did. It was as if the light emanating from him hid his features, but at the same time revealed everything I needed to feel. He didn't speak, but the peace I felt was so real it seemed to touch my skin. In subsequent dreams, he drew closer. Sometimes he would place his hand on my shoulder. Sometimes he would guide me along paths I didn't recognize. Sometimes he would simply stay by my side while I cried without understanding why. I would always wake up with an inexplicable feeling, as if someone had held my heart during the night. I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not the women in the room. It was my secret, my refuge, My silent calling. And that's how it was. Exactly like that. That Jesus began to enter my life without me even realizing it. He didn't enter by force. He didn't enter through fear. He entered through the emptiness I was trying to hide. He entered through the questions I didn't have the courage to ask aloud. He entered through the pain I carried alone. He entered without pressure, without imposition, without noise, only with light. I can still feel the exact moment my life changed direction, as if the world held its breath for a moment, before shattering completely. It was night, very late, and I had just returned from the bathroom after yet another of those secret reading sessions. The Bible was camouflaged among the blankets, wrapped inside an old pillowcase, as if it were just another piece of fabric. I was already used to this ritual of hiding and unhiding, of watching and studying, of fearing and searching at the same time. But that night, something was different. The silence seemed heavier, denser, almost as if it were announcing that something was about to happen. Rana, my roommate, had woken up thirsty. I heard the creaking of her mattress, but I didn't have time to react. She walked slowly around the room, still half asleep, and tripped right on the pillowcase where I hid the Bible. The impact was small, but enough to make the book slip out through the opening in the fabric. And when the dark cover appeared in the dim light, illuminated only by the sliver of light coming from the half-open door, I knew in that second that my life was about to crumble. She stared at the book as if it were a dangerous creature, as if that object were capable of destroying everything around it. Her eyes widened, her face paled, and before I could say anything, she took a step back, put her hands to her face, and let out a scream that seemed to tear through the silence of the entire center. I stood up so quickly I almost fell. I tried to stifle her scream, tried to explain, tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. Her panic had already become a flame, and when fear becomes a flame, no one can control it. The doors swung open. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Guards entered the room with bright flashlights, illuminating every corner as if searching for an explosive. One of them pulled back the pillowcase. The book fell to the floor, and I saw their expressions change. It wasn't just surprise. It was something between contempt, indignation, and obligation. A terrible mix. "Whose is this?" asked the tallest officer, his voice harsh and accusatory. I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. Rana pointed at me, her hands trembling. "It's hers. She reads it. I saw it. She hides it here." It was as if I had heard the sentence before it was even pronounced. 2 guards grabbed my arms, pulled me out of the room, while my mother woke up startled, running after us, begging them to let me go. "She's my daughter. She didn't do anything. Please." Her despair pierced me, but I couldn't even look back. I could only see the floor being dragged beneath my feet as I was led down the narrow corridors. I was placed in a small room, lit by a single lamp on the ceiling, so bright it made my eyes water. They tied me to a metal chair, cold as ice, which seemed to steal the warmth from my body. And then the interrogation began. Hours. I lost track of time. Men in traditional clothing spoke to me, alternating between artificial calm and veiled threats. They asked why I had that book, who had given it to me, who was influencing me, if I had ever spoken to Christians, if I wanted to abandon my original faith. It was a continuous bombardment. I tried to explain that I was just looking for answers, that none of this was an attack on anyone, that I didn't want to cause trouble. But every word I said seemed to be interpreted in the worst possible way. I saw judgment in their eyes, silent condemnation. I felt that any poorly chosen phrase could become evidence against me. It was like walking through an emotional minefield while trying to hide the fact that my heart was beating faster and faster, almost painfully, tight. They mentioned apostasy, a word that hit me like a blow, not uttered in anger but coldly, as if they already knew how it would end. I felt my throat close up. It was as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. Apostasy is not a loose word. It carries entire systems, historical weights, centuries-old punishments, and there I was, alone, being accused of exactly that. After hours without a definite answer, 2 men entered the room with documents in hand. They spoke amongst themselves for a few minutes, in hushed voices. And then the one who seemed to be the leader of the group approached me with a grave expression. "The court will make the final decision. You will be summoned to a public hearing. You will choose before everyone, the Quran or the Bible." He looked at me for a moment that seemed far too long. "And the choice will determine your fate." I was returned to my cell, dazed, weak, trembling as if I had been through an earthquake. My mother only managed to see me for a second, as they led me from one corridor to another. She tried to hug me, but was pushed away by the guards. Her gaze, a mixture of panic, helplessness, and love, remained etched within me like an invisible scar. The next morning, they took me to the hearing room. It was a large room, full of imams, judges, officials, and even cameras. I felt like an object placed in the center of a stage where everyone awaited my downfall. The Quran was on a table, perfectly aligned. The Bible beside it seemed tiny, worn, almost insignificant against the backdrop. But it burned inside me like a live ember. When they told me to choose, the silence that fell was so profound that I could hear my own pulse beating in my ears. And yet, inside me there was a strange peace, a peace that made no sense in the face of the threat, but that enveloped me like an invisible cloak. It was as if the man in white from my dreams was there beside me, saying nothing, simply present. I chose the Bible. The murmur that echoed through the room was like a tremor. The sentence was announced almost immediately. There was no discussion, no attempt at dialogue, just the final decision. I would be executed, taken straight from there to a dark cell, without windows, without a bed, without any belongings. I sat on the floor, hugged my knees, and remained in absolute silence. My mind tried to cling to that peace I had felt minutes before, but my body reacted with fear, trembling, cold. Hours later, maybe days, I really don't know. They opened the cell door and dragged me out. They put me in a car with tinted windows and drove off without saying where. The sound of the engine, the smell of worn leather, the vibration of the vehicle, everything seemed distant, as if I were floating above myself, watching the scene from the outside, till the car stopped. The desert was silent, illuminated by the moon with a pale, cold glow. My legs gave way as they pulled me from the car. They led me to a hole dug in the sand. Not very deep, but wide enough for me to fit through. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were involuntarily drawn to it. The sight of that empty space, ready to receive me, made something inside me break. And I could still hear Colonel al-Rashid repeating that brutal phrase in my mind. "Choose this Bible, and you will be buried with it." They put me inside the hole. The sand was cold, then hot, then cold again. I felt each grain touching my skin like tiny needles. They started throwing sand over me, slowly at first, then faster. The weight increased. The pressure rose in my chest, and I could no longer move my arms. The sand climbed up my neck, my chin, the sides of my face. I tried to breathe, but the air came in short, disorganized bursts. The world began to blur, and then dark, very dark. It was in that last second, when my body was already giving up, when I couldn't breathe anymore, when my soul seemed to be leaving my body, that I felt it. The touch, the same touch of dreams. The man in white placed his hand on my shoulder, not forcefully, not urgently, but with such profound gentleness that, even breathless, my heart calmed. There was no fear, there was no pain, only presence. And then came the tremor, a powerful tremor, as if the desert itself were responding to the touch of that man. The sand began to move, to flow, to slide out of the hole. I felt the weight lift from my chest. I felt the air return. I felt a warm light envelop my body. The light lifted me, pulled me upwards as if I were too light to remain bound to that fate. The guards screamed. The oldest imam fainted. The colonel took 3 steps back, unable to utter a coherent sentence. I heard someone say, "We can't go on. This is bigger than us." And for the first time in a long time, something inside me whispered, "You didn't die." Because he didn't let you. They didn't know what to do with me. They put me back in a car, trembling even more than before, and silently deported me to Jordan without any explanation. They wouldn't let me see my mother. They wouldn't let me take anything. They simply handed me over to another group of officers, like passing on a secret too dangerous to keep. Jordan seemed peaceful, but inside me there was a dull, deep pain, because I felt I had lost my family forever. It was like surviving the impossible, and, at the same time, carrying the weight of a nameless grief. I tried to adapt, but everything seemed strange, incomplete, suspended, until months later, I received an illegal phone call. It was Omar, one of the guards who witnessed the miracle in the desert. He spoke softly, his voice trembling. "I want to meet the Jesus who saved you." And he wasn't the only one. Other officers began sending secret messages, trying to understand what they had seen that night. They wanted answers. They wanted to know how I survived. They wanted to know who that man was. And at that moment, I realized that my faith was about to be tested again. Not with fear, not with threat, but with responsibility. I took a deep breath and said to myself, if Jesus saved me in the desert, now it's my turn to help others find that light. In the end, when I look back and revisit each step of my journey, from the destroyed streets of Gaza to the heavy silence of the cells in Riyadh, from the suffocating fear of the grave to the light that snatched me from death, I understand that nothing happened by chance. Every tear that fell, every night I felt lost, every forbidden doubt that grew inside my chest, all of that was leading me to the moment when I finally discovered that Jesus was never far away. He was there, in my dreams, in the unexpected words I found, in the people who appeared in my path as if they were living answers to questions I never dared to ask. The truth is, he didn't just save me in the desert. He had been saving me long before, little by little, silently, until I could see it. Nothing I've lived through can be erased, but I can decide what to do with this story, and I choose to transform pain into testimony, fear into courage, despair into hope. I choose to speak, because if my life was spared, it wasn't to be kept silent. It was to say, with everything I have, that he still saves, still heals, still appears in places where no one else appears. And if you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. So now I ask you, subscribe to the channel to continue receiving messages that strengthen faith. Leave your like so that more people can find this hope, and write in the comments the phrase, "I love Jesus," to show that you are walking with me to the end. Get ready. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's the next story. Saudi princess caught reading the Bible and her death was marked until Jesus appeared, and you won't want to miss what happened.